Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. The focus of today's webinar will be Deaf Thriving. I'm Thomas K. Holcomb, and this is the fourth and last of a series of webinars to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Deaf Studies Division. We're very proud to be serving our local deaf community for the last 50 years. These webinars have been focused on deaf-centered approaches to academic and professional success of deaf and hard of hearing people. A visual description of myself: I am a white male in his early 60s with dirty blonde hair, wearing a gray shirt. My background is a plain gray wall. And that is, again, for the benefit of those who may be blind or deafblind. Before proceeding, we must acknowledge the land where we are situated here at Ohlone College. The tribes of the Ohlone people have long lived on this land, long before it was occupied by colonizers. We at Ohlone are committed to honoring the beautiful culture of the Ohlone peoples and to be inspired by it in everything we do here at Ohlone to promote peace, respect, and justice for all. It's baked into everything we do here at Ohlone. This webinar will last about an hour and a half. There will be no Q&A in the interest of time. However, the Zoom Q&A feature is enabled for you to enter questions. After the webinar, we will develop an FAQ in response to your questions, and we'll post it on the resource page after the event on BAADA and also on ohlone.edu. Also, the chat feature is disabled as people have found it to be distracting. We have with us three wonderful interpreters supporting the webinar. The person you're hearing speaking right now is Aaron Brace. Aaron is a white man with a close-cropped salt and pepper beard. Our next interpreter is Annie Diekman. Annie is an Asian woman with black hair and glasses. And next we have Stephanie Chow, our third amazing interpreter supporting this webinar. Stephanie is also an Asian woman with glasses and black hair. At Ohlone, we've had a 50-year history in supporting the academic success of our students through 4 different programs. They include the Deaf program with classes taught in ASL for deaf and hard of hearing students, the ASL Deaf Studies program for people wanting to learn ASL and to study deaf culture, the Deaf-Centered Interpreting Preparation program. This is for advanced students who want to pursue an interpreting career in order to support the deaf community. And we have support services such as interpreting, note-taking, and tutoring for students who take mainstream classes on the larger Ohlone campus. In addition, we have the Gallaudet University Western Regional Center, which is housed here at Ohlone, to share Gallaudet resources throughout the 13 Western states. Gallaudet has so much to offer. And the regional center here brings all of their information to our region out in the West. We're proud to have them hosted here at Ohlone College. As I said, this is the 4th webinar. The previous ones have been Deaf-Centered Presenting, which was co-hosted by the Gallaudet University Western Regional Center. And that took place on February 15th. In that webinar, we explored how to construct a presentation in a way that's most conducive to its enjoyment by deaf audience members. The second webinar was deaf-centered interpreting. I beg your pardon. Deaf-centered student outcomes. On the deaf-centered interpreting webinar, we wanted to focus on how interpreting services can best be provided so that they're the most engaging for deaf students and to improve student learning outcomes. We want students to be engaged in their learning, and we want interpreters to feel inspired by providing effective service. In April, we had the Deaf-Centered Learning webinar, co-hosted by the California School for the Deaf, which is here in Fremont. This explored how best to teach material so that it's most readily understood and learned by deaf students. And now the fourth and final one, as I mentioned, is Deaf-Centered Thriving, which is co-hosted by the Bay Area Asian Deaf Association. And we're thrilled to work with them in this partnership. These webinars are really important to us because thriving as a deaf individual can be a very difficult task, and many of us have taken a very long journey to get there. Too many of us have struggled to make sense of who we are. We've been not allowed to use sign language in our formative years. We've been forced into an oral exclusive method of communication. And we've suffered at the hands of so-called professionals who allegedly are the experts on deafness. They're the ones that have told our well-intentioned parents that signing was not going to be good for us. But they really are not the ones that should be considered the experts on the lives of deaf people. As a result, we have struggled, we've experienced trauma. And we need then to shine a light on what it means to thrive as a deaf person. And deaf people have thrived in all walks of life. What it means to thrive as a deaf person is common across the various communities that form the deaf community. But we know that certain communities have felt the oppression more keenly than others. Our goal here is to discuss how we can support deaf children on their journeys so that they can be thriving deaf adults. Bay Area Asian Deaf Association also sees this as a very important goal, and we're thrilled that they are working with us today in co-hosting this webinar. Over 80 people registered, some from other countries. We're very happy to be able to present this to you today. Some of our alumni came to us from other countries and have returned to their home countries. And we're glad that you're able to join us again for this webinar. You're a very important part of our community. It's now my honor to introduce Renu Whetstone, who is an Ohlone alumna. She has now become a counselor with an MA degree. She'll be facilitating today's webinar discussion with 4 panelists. Thank you for watching, and I hope you get a lot of food for thought in the next hour and a half or so. Renu, take it away.
Sorry, hi. I was struggling turning my camera on. Anyways, thank you so much. Thank you, Tom, for that wonderful introduction. I am thrilled to be facilitating this panel today. We've got 4 great deaf Asian panelists with us, who I would like to introduce now. Before I get started, again, I want to introduce myself. I'm Renu Whetstone. My visual background is I'm a brown-skinned Indian descended woman with a black shirt, shoulder-length black hair. And so now let's go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Wonha. Park. Wonha. Hi, I'm Wonha Park. This is my name sign. My visual description, I currently have a gray and blurred out background. I have short black hair that is lightly permed. I have wired rim glasses, a light mustache. I am of Asian descent, in my mid-30s, a black shirt that has a logo on the left, which is the BAADA logo. Renew is saying, thank you so much, Wonha. Next, we have Baraj. Josh Nani. Baraj.
Hello, everyone. My name is Baraj Jashnani. This is my sign name. My background currently is blurred, and I have long hair. Light cream-colored sweater or light cream-colored shirt with a patterned sweater over it. And I'm also of Indian descent.
Next, we have Michelle Yuk. Michelle.
Hello, my name is Michelle Yuk. My background is a plain gray background. I have shoulder-length black hair, and I'm wearing glasses. I'm about 45 years old. I have a blue shirt with a sweater over it that's maroon colored.
Last but not least, we have William Wong. William.
Hello, everyone. I'm William Wong. My background is blurred out. I am a Chinese American man. I have gray hair that's rather close cropped, and I'm wearing a gray polo shirt.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. We are so thrilled to have you on the panel today. Our first question that we have for our panelists today is, please tell us about your background. If you wouldn't mind telling us about where you came from. And this will help give us insight into the Asian deaf identity as an immigrant, and also how that affects your professional experience. Wonha? Hi, Wonha here. Again, my name is Wonha. I am from South Korea. I was born in Seoul, and I moved to the US the summer of 2014. I came as a student to go to Ohlone College to get my AA in English. And so ASL and English are my third and fourth language. And I recently transferred to California State University, East Bay. And I'm going to be majoring in criminal justice. And so currently I serve as the BAADA president. I also work full-time at TollWorks. And I also work as an assistant caretaker with various deaf plus individuals. Renew saying, you sound like a very busy man. Oh, one Jose, if you don't mind, I have one more thing I'd like to add. My family is Korean. My whole family is hearing. None of them sign. So I grew up being able to speak and lip read Korean. And so I grew up oral. And so that is how I communicate with my family. And when I moved to the US, that is really where I found my deaf identity, and where I accepted my identity as a LGBTQ person, as a queer person, trans, as well as Asian and deaf. Renew saying, thank you so much. That's such a rich background. Thank you so much for sharing with us all.
I can
Michelle.
go ahead. Yes, I was similar to Wonha. I was born in Seoul, South Korea. I was born hard of hearing, and I grew up oral as well in the South Korean system. My family moved here to the US when I was about 14 years old in 1992. And that's where I picked up American Sign Language, and I graduated from San Francisco State University with a master's in social work. And I also work at Toolworks, working with various deaf clients. And I also work as an advocate and a counselor as work under Deaf Counseling Advocacy and Referral Agency, DACARA. And I work kind of various professional fields, such as educating. I focus primarily on the deaf and the hard of hearing and late deaf populations. And I'm happy to be
Thank you
here.
so much for sharing. Thank you so much for sharing your background. Biraj.
I'm from India and I moved here many years ago. And in India, I had a lot of struggles with accessing education. I went through the mainstream program. I was the only deaf student out of 400 hearing children. And so when someone was presenting and writing on the board, I missed so much of that education. But I was very fortunate. I had an incredible family support throughout my education. My parents, my brother, the four of us are incredibly close to each other and very supportive in various ways. So I just go along with life, and as my parents, taught me to really focus on my English education. And then we moved to the US and I entered Ohlone College, and that was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. I just learned about writing a lot more, honed in my writing skills, writing essays. And before we moved out here, I wasn't quite as skilled in that way. But writing, wow, that was really important to me. So I signed up for this 101A class, and when I first entered English 101A class, and I didn't really know what the 101A meant. I wasn't quite sure what, the American education system, how that all works. I had really no knowledge about that. So I just went along as best I could. And I had someone advise me that it's best to start a little bit lower and journey up to 101A. My sister was the one who told me that. I'm just scratching the surface still. I want to get my master's, and I love the incredible support here that I've gotten from Ohlone, the staff and faculty here. I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you so much. William?
Yeah. I was born in Hong Kong. I'm sure you're familiar with the one country, two system rule that China has, where Hong Kong is considered to be part of China. My parents didn't even know that I was deaf. I just wasn't speaking. They took me to the doctor to try to figure out what was going on. And that's when they found out that I couldn't hear. They did finally find a school for the deaf, which I was sent to. I went in at kindergarten, and it was a brand new experience for me. My mom took me there. And when we walked through the hallway, I saw people signing. I wasn't signing at that point myself. And I saw just how engaged the children were in classroom activities because they could sign and they were receiving their education that way. I didn't understand because I'd just been exposed to oral communication, just like Wonha. And I got one of those old-fashioned hearing aids that involved a receiver that you wore in your body with a wire that went up to the earphones that went into your ears. That didn't work for me, but I had to have it on all throughout the day. Whenever I tried to take it off, though, I'd get my hand slapped with a ruler. And I was told consistently that if I learn how to speak well, I'd be able to go to college. And that was what made me feel very inhibited in learning and using sign language. But I went through schooling mostly just by learning on my own through reading and memorizing, not so much through what I got in the classroom. So we were learning to read Chinese characters. And one day there was an article about sign language. And it was, and the first thing that I learned about when I ultimately came to the US for education was I went to Tennessee. And it was my brother who had learned about Ohlone College, and that's how I ended up at Ohlone because of the deaf program. And once I got to Ohlone, I knew that my life was about to change. And all of that suppression that I had of my opportunities to learn, just it all ended that day. And it's because of Ohlone that I'm able to be where I am now.
So you all have such diverse backgrounds. You learned sign language at different ages. You moved to the US at different ages. In terms of ASL and English, also learned it at different languages. And so definitely so many different experiences here. And that definitely shaped who you all are today. So really, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your background. And we will definitely be talking more about your background and how that highlights your experience. So our next question is, seeing that you are all thriving deaf Asians now, some of you are teachers, managers, social workers. I mean, these are things that you should be very proud of. But when you look back at your parents' attitude and society's oppression of you because of your deafness, how did that impact you? How did that affect you and in terms of who you are today? And what would you like folks to know about that experience? Garage?
As I mentioned before, the Indian education system was very challenging for me. The teachers all spoke a particular language and I struggled to understand. My mother actually hired a special tutor for me to sit with me in the classroom and to help me through all the various topics, history, mathematics, and the various school subjects. And I was able to graduate high school from that. And I so wanted to go to college and see that life, that advanced, life. I was so excited to go, but I was discriminated against because the president of the university told me that they already accepted 3 deaf students and they wouldn't accept a 4th. And so I tried to prove that, look how successful I was in school, but they said no, and they wouldn't accept me as a student. So that was very disheartening. I wanted to be a clothing designer or fashion designer, but my mom, we went together and I got married before I moved out here, and I didn't think about education anymore. I kind of gave up on that dream because of that discrimination I faced. And I didn't think America would welcome me. I figured I would face the same discrimination when I moved here. But my mother said, no, go to America, try to go to college, get your education there. And I really I was very reluctant. But I went in and they accepted me with open arms and they welcomed me to Ohlone College. I was so thrilled. It was a new education, new school. I got friends and a signing environment for the first time. I saw people working. I saw deaf individuals and how interpretation worked. And I was just so amazed by what was offered. I felt so incredibly blessed to be here. India told me I couldn't be all of these things because of my deafness, because of who I was. And here I was able to find all of that. I had access to so much. The fact that Ohlone college accepted me allowed me to move up in my education journey. For that education that I received there, I've got full-time jobs. I got to have a full-time job at Toolworks, working with so many various clients from so many different backgrounds, Latinx and some Indian just like me, and some staff members who are of various backgrounds, Asian, Latinx, white folks too, and people who are experienced with the CSD, California School for the Deaf in Fremont. And we all have, you know, now we're seeing the next generation of deaf children come through, and seeing all of them go through their education system. And I think it's so incredibly important to encourage that, so they have a rich experience and they have the support they need from their teachers and their principal and everything. That support system is so rich. And so that's what I like to focus on.
Really, you've came a long way from being able to, from the oppression that you face and the experiences that you're able to have now. Thank you so much, Wonha. Thank you, Braj, so much for sharing your struggles and the challenges you faced in India. You know, I feel like my experiences in Korea were similar and different in many ways. I was mainstreamed for 6 years before I went to the deaf school. And that experience really caused me to lose my deaf identity. You know, when I was in a mainstream school, all my teachers obviously spoke. All my tests were done with me trying to lip read. And I was constantly lost, right? I was constantly failing my classes. I was the unique one. I was the deaf one. I did not have interpreters, and nobody was really helping in terms of writing things down for me and writing down instructions for me. And so once school was over, I'd go home exhausted, constantly exhausted, right? And when I went to the deaf school finally, I realized, oh, you know, now that everything is done in visual communication, like I was able to learn more, right? And that was, you know, I'd be able, but then basically having gone through the mainstream experience and then being put into the deaf world and not being exposed to sign language until that point, I was still lost, right? It was like, looking back now, it was a really horrible experience because I basically went from one environment where I didn't understand to another environment where I still didn't understand what was happening. And so that language deprivation really just plays a number on folks. And at that time, I really identified as being hard of hearing. So my mother really wanted me to go to the university in Korea, and I refused. And so my mom and I got into a bit of a tiff about it, but you know, I was pretty stubborn and I wanted to follow my own ideas of what I wanted, pretty rebellious in nature, right? And I felt like this decision was really important and it was mine to make. So I saved up my money and I moved here to the United States. And this is really when I learned how to have a positive deaf identity, right? When I was in Korea, I never received support or help as a deaf individual, right? A lot of folks, you know, my parents would take care of me, or they would be like, wow, you know, my parents, like, giving them all the accolades. When I came out here, I was realizing that, you know, there's so many deaf events, deaf expos, and there was constantly people who would be walking with people who were deaf plus, like they would have, and like they would have a staff member, and I didn't quite understand what was going on. And so I had just moved to the US. There was a lot of things I didn't quite understand. I you know, especially if you're deaf plus, you in Korea, you wouldn't get any support. And I was seeing how folks here would have aides, they would have support people with them, and all these other resources. And I have never seen that before in Korea. And typically in Korea, those for deaf plus would stay at home. Their parents would take care of them. You wouldn't get any government support. And still to this day, it is still like that in Korea. And so for me, being in America and seeing how much support those who are Deaf Plus have, it's been amazing, right? Like I worked and struggled so much myself in terms of my own personal journey. And for me, one of my biggest challenges was working with Deaf Plus folks because I had never really encountered one when I lived in Korea. And really looking at that and seeing their experiences really helped me kind of find my identity and realizing that I have more rights, right? I have a lot of privilege. I'm able to walk, I'm able to sign. I have my own independence, and those who are Deaf Plus don't. And so we need to figure out how we are able to lift them up. I know that there's still a lot of discrimination and racism that is happening in America. There's white privilege, right? And I feel like there's a lot of parallels that could be drawn between an able-bodied deaf person versus those who are Deaf Plus, right? There is a lot of privilege I have over other folks. And so recognizing all the varieties of privileges that folks have and also the challenges I have as a trans person, right? And I think that is my role and my responsibility is to be a support for those who are Deaf Plus so that they're able to learn lessons and really grow and help them thrive as well. Renew, thank you so much for sharing that. There is a lot of oppression that we face. Language deprivation, that is such a common theme, right? Not only in the Asian community, but also here in America as well, right? To have the privilege to learn. I mean, that's huge. Wonha said, yeah, I agree. Renew, I just appreciate you so much and the work and the support you provide the Deaf Plus community, right? And facing and using your own challenges and faith and to overcome and helping them overcome. Wonha saying, you know, a lot of folks who are Deaf Plus, they aren't able to have that spontaneous conversation, right? Their access, because those who are Deaf Plus are able to sign, right? And it's important for us to meet them where they're at. A lot of them have their own trauma and their own baggage that they're carrying. And it's our responsibility to meet them where they're at communication-wise so that we can draw that out. Renew, yeah, again, like talking about language deprivation, right? That experience that a lot of us have and how that shapes us and who we are today and where and why we do the work we do now. Anybody else want to add to that? William?
Yeah, I second what Wonha said in terms of language deprivation and the internalized oppression that comes with only being exposed to the oral method. We could sign only in our off times during school, not in the classroom. The teachers were vehemently against the use of sign language, as was the principal. We were constantly being told that if we didn't learn how to speak well, we would have very poor use of language at all. We were constantly being told that using sign language would really hurt our development of literacy, which, you know, didn't really make sense. On the one hand, we were seeing just how lively and engaged everyone was when they were allowed to sign, and how we were all just the opposite when we had to only learn through an oral method. So that led to a lot of isolation. And I wanted to go to Gallaudet University, but I failed the English entrance exam. And I went to Ohlone, where they had this wonderful deaf program where you had professors who not only signed, but were themselves deaf. And that's what made me realize that deaf people can actually go to graduate school because these professors had. So I buckled down and worked hard and ultimately did go to Gallaudet University finally, as I had dreamed of going in the past. But yeah, that all came out of a really bad start from having my deaf identity oppressed. And it had to do with the educational system that I started out in. The oral philosophy, the oral only philosophy, and the banning of sign language was a real barrier that I had to find my way over. And it was only through getting to Ohlone College, like as some of you others have shared, that I found a different way. It's all well and good to learn how to speak and to use residual hearing if you can, but that's not the only way.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I remember going into CSES 12 and seeing another deaf person and being like, oh, there's deaf teachers here. There are deaf people, deaf adults. They're having conversations with one another. And so, yes, I completely understand that feeling of going into Gallaudet for the first time and feeling overwhelmed with just being in the deaf world for the first time, and how inspiring that feels and how good it feels to be finally connected to our community. Michelle, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, sure, I can make a comment. First, I really appreciate everything people have been saying about the experience of deaf people in the U.S., especially access to education, access to communication, which can be a huge benefit in education. You know, where I was born, my parents had no idea if I was actually born hard of hearing or deaf until I was 7 months. I was 7 months premature to start with. I had to be put into an incubator for 3 months. My sister, who studied communication as her educational focus, thought that might have had an impact on my hearing, and specifically studied communication disorders. I'm not sure exactly if that had an impact, but my parents suspected maybe at some point they started to suspect that I was hard of hearing. They would call my name and I wouldn't respond unless it was said in a specific frequency, in a higher pitch frequency. So my mother, my mother would call out my name, and I wouldn't notice it. If my mother called my name, I would notice it, but if my father did, I would not. So they decided to get me hearing aids to help me with that process. And my father realized I was hard of hearing. My father was actually devastated when he found that out. And my father himself is also hard of hearing. He's still in denial on that as well. And he's sort of in denial about me and my hard of hearing status too. I wanted to go to the deaf school. I went to a mainstream school and visited there, but they were telling me, I could learn speech in the mainstream program if my parents decided they wanted me to keep me with my younger sister so she could interpret for me in the program. But that put on a lot of responsibility for my sibling to have to go around with me in that way. I preferred to sit in the back of the back room, but the back of the classroom, but that forced me to have to sit up front to learn the oral approach to learning so I could lip read and that sort of thing. And they were very strict on that approach. I couldn't really learn sign language. I didn't really have full access to communication. And my education was a huge struggle for me. I didn't have enough access to it. It wasn't until I was about 14 years old, we moved out here to the US in 1992. And when we got here, it was my experience. It was such a culture shock for me to be here in the US. To see so much diversity in people was such a different experience for me. In Korea, there's a lot of you see a lot of the same people, especially around the same age group. I struggled to connect with people because I didn't sign either. So I just really suffered access to communication in general. My sister would go around with me and support me through the school system, of course. I feel incredibly lucky to have one interpreter who was actually willing to come and tutor me in language classes, teaching me more of the signed English signing style instead of full American Sign Language. There's a huge difference between American Sign Language and signing exact English. And I didn't really get access to ASL until I went to college. When I look back on my childhood and my father's oppression against me, that really impacted me until I was about 17. He really hurt my feelings a lot. He referred to me as inferior, even though we were actually suffering the same thing. And same as many other people too. I never felt included in my family. I never felt included in my community. I was often isolated. I got a lot more benefit from reading alone. I was lucky that my parents did have higher education and they encouraged me to obtain higher education as well. I went to UC Davis. I prefer to be closer to my family instead of going out to Gallaudet University, but I am happy I stayed here in California and graduated from UC Davis. I wasn't quite ready to go out of my comfort zone yet. And after graduating UC Davis, it was a real struggle to find a job. I studied art and painting and photography, but I really had a hard time developing my own social skills to connect with others, and I wasn't able to really express myself very well, and I wasn't comfortable socializing. I signed up for a DOR, a Department Rehabilitation program, to help me search for a job. I learned so much from that experience. That led to other opportunities. I wanted to work with parents and build relationships with the communities similar to my age, similar age group. Encouraging access to different language and to discourage any kind of oppression. I feel here in the US, we're very lucky. We have so many deaf people that we can learn from. So I feel very fortunate to be here.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your personal experiences. I know one common theme that all the panelists have mentioned was, all of you started off oral and learning oral, and that was what your parents expected you and wanted you to do, right? Regardless of your country of origin, that was a common experience you all have. And most of your parents today, they're seeing you thrive, right? You are all successful in your lives. And I understand that feeling of maybe having unresolved feelings, right? That you haven't worked through yet. But we do have the choice to move on, let go, instead of holding on to our anger. And a lot of the comments that were made today, I can completely relate to. You have folks, somebody here from India, South Korea, Hong Kong. So my third question for you all, seeing that you have all immigrated from another country to the US, what barriers and biases have you guys faced as Asian deaf immigrants? And what has been the most frustrating? Wonha, so are you talking about our country of origin? Or are you talking about here in the US? And Renew saying specifically here, as a deaf Asian person, your experience moving here to the US, or as a deaf Asian American, depending on how you identify, right? What barriers have you faced when moving out here? Wonha speaking. Well, when I moved here, I really believed in the American dream. I believed that I would get a better education here. I moved to the US and I just realized there was just a wealth of information and knowledge here that I did not have back in Korea. Not only as a deaf person, but also as an Asian person, right? I think one of my biggest frustrations, we had all these international students at Ohlone College, some from Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and we would get together and study together in the evenings. I really struggled with math and English grammar at the time, right? And other folks wouldn't have the same struggles as me. And that was something that I found really interesting, right? The person from Thailand that we studied with, people from Japan, that they all seemed to have a grasp on math that I didn't. Interestingly, there was another international deaf student from Korea who was in this particular international student study group who also struggled with math similarly to me. And so as we were talking and sharing about our experiences, we actually came from the same deaf school. They signed a little bit. They mostly used the oral approach. And what we realized, we missed out on a lot of education, particularly our math education. So coming to the US, we were realizing there was a lot of stuff like, for example, formulas that we did not understand. And that was specifically because of this one Korean deaf school that did not have enough teachers and was not educating the students properly. Most of the other international deaf students, they came to the US for education as well, because they were able to access more education compared to where they were at home. And so we believed that American deaf folks, right, had more access to education. And we are asking for American deaf folks to have more patience with us and to help us. But that wasn't, we were hoping to get more support from American deaf folks, but that wasn't necessarily the case because we signed a lot slower, because we were still learning ASL. So oftentimes they would leave us out and wouldn't include us as they would hang out with one another. And so it felt very cliquey. And as I started signing more and more, this one particular person, that I was chatting with, because I signed slowly, because I was still learning ASL, they walked away from me. They walked away from that conversation. They were not interested in dialoguing with me. And so that was one thing that I noticed, a huge barrier that I faced was a lot of American deaf folks did not have the patience for international deaf folks like I was hoping they would be. And now that I've been here for 5 years and 9 years, I'm a lot more familiar and well-versed in American culture and in the language. But at that time when I first moved, there were so many things I didn't know and so many things I missed out on and didn't get help. And so I feel like there needs to be more patience among American deaf folks, more support for international students. We are eager to learn, we're ready to learn, right? And if deaf folks ignore us, like that's just another form of discrimination. And that was one frustration I faced. In terms of as being Asian, I faced discrimination again from white folks. And they look at me as Asian, a Korean, they look down on me. They assume that Koreans all have bad tempers. And they had all these stereotypes that they believed of me. And so they would assume that me and the other Korean international deaf students, deaf international students, we all had the same mannerisms or the same temper or the same behaviors and personalities. And so that was another experience that I had. One time I was sitting on BART and there was a Black individual who started getting aggressive towards me. And I started learning more and realizing more about anti-Asian hate at that moment. And so I feel like white folks might not have gotten physically aggressive with me, but they would be verbally demeaning towards me. And so I feel like other South Asians, people of Latinx descent, those are the folks who I feel like I've gotten the most support from and the most encouragement from. And so, and then in terms of my LGBTQ identity, I feel like there's been a lot of discrimination in terms of gender discrimination, especially when I was in Korea, right? In Korea, there is very distinct gender roles. Women cooked, men didn't cook. And if a man was cooking, people in Korea would look at that person and be like, why are you cooking? Right? The gender roles were very distinct and separate. And from my perspective, as anybody who wants to learn how to cook can cook. Anybody who wants to be an engineer can be an engineer. Your gender doesn't matter. But in Korea, the gender roles were very distinct and separate. And so in Korea, I was not that typical Korean femme Korean woman who wanted to look nice and pretty. And so I faced a lot of discrimination because I did not act the way a traditional Korean woman would behave. And so when I moved here to the US, specifically in California, for my experience visiting the West Coast and the East Coast, culturally, it's very different. And so I feel the most comfortable here in California. I feel free in order to use whatever gendered bathroom I would feel comfortable using. I'm able to follow my preference, my preferred pronouns, and that they're respected as well. And I feel more accepted here compared to the East Coast. I feel like my experience in the East Coast, I faced a lot more frustrations and discrimination as an LGBTQ person. I remember walking into a hotel, gave them my ID card. The staff person looked at my ID and looked at me and just kept looking back and forth because my legal name on my ID did not necessarily match what I look like now. And so they couldn't believe that I was the same person that was on my ID card. And so they spent a lot of time just analyzing my ID and the way I look in person. And so I felt unsafe. It felt somewhat dangerous compared to how I feel when I'm on the West Coast, where I feel a lot more safe. I feel so much more comfortable and relaxed here. You know, people, I understand, have very different reasons on why they moved to a variety of different states, whether that's Texas or DC. And it doesn't really matter where you go. It doesn't matter where your family ends up. Like, people should be able to be who they are and not hide their identity. And so, but I understand that a lot of people face so much discrimination depending on where they live. And so that is definitely another type of trauma and frustration that I faced. And particularly if you're deaf, you're Asian, you're LGBTQ, you're a trans person, all of these identities are things that we hold, and the oppression we face from all these identities just get built up inside of us. And so, you know, oftentimes you see other folks happy and free to live their lives, and you'll think, why can't I also be happy to live the way I want to live? And so those are things that I've experienced. So Renew, sadly, Asian, we have a long history of oppression and discrimination here. And today we are still facing them. And those stereotypes are slowly changing, but we still do have a lot of work to do, particularly around stereotypes regarding the Asian community. And I know that there's so many more layers to that when you talk about your other identities as well. And especially with you as the BAADA president, you are a huge role model for future generations. So thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate what you had to say. Anyone else? When you moved to the US, anybody want to share barriers that you faced?
This is William. I really can relate to Wonha's experiences. That you get stereotype upon stereotype by being deaf and being of Asian descent. After I got my AA degree, I went to Gallaudet University. In the cafeteria, there'd be maybe 500 students at a time. And yet people would sort of separate out by interests or by ethnicity. And there'd be the Asian students. But I remember a student coming up and saying, well, you guys are the smart ones, right? You all know math, you all know science. And we tried to disabuse them of that misunderstanding, that stereotype. But they also asked us if we all knew Kung Fu, which they thought was so funny. And I said, yeah, I wish, but no, we don't. Yeah, somebody also was saying that you all look like you're very, very repressed in terms of your personalities, which is another stereotype that's not true. I just think people need to be aware of the stereotypes that they've got stuck in their heads and get rid of them. We have lives just like anybody else. We have interests as varied as anyone else's. And the student body government, being involved in the student body government helped me a lot. And I had to pass food certification in order to be involved in a food related activity of the student body government. And I was able to get some of the other students of Asian descent in from various Asian countries, from India. And then I was able to become a teacher of the food safety course. And then we could host a banquet. We hosted a banquet that would showcase our different cultures so that they would learn that, first of all, Asians are not monolithic, and also that we have rich cultures, that we're not just these repressed, quiet students that they would have expected Asian students to be. This is like, I'm quite a bit older than you are, but I'm so glad to hear your experiences and to see you assuming leadership in BAADA. And although what I went through was 40 years ago, it looks like some of the stuff is still going on, but I see new leaders rising up, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Barrage, Michelle, would you like to add anything?
I'll add a little bit about the barriers I faced in India and compare them to what I faced here. As we mentioned earlier, deafness is a 24/7 sort of disability, and that's how it's seen in India. There's no access to communication. So when the conversations are happening, we're often isolated, even among people. There are no captions, there's no visual access to information. It's incredibly frustrating. We don't really have a lot of friends, even among our hearing friends. They're having conversations. They might be on the phone. We're trying to text message, but they're talking on the phone. And we're just missing out on so much socialization that's happening around us. And when we try to ask to catch up on that information, they're saying, oh, we forgot this. And so it's just an incredible barrier, access to information. And coming out to the US, there's barriers here too, definitely. As an immigrant, getting visas, that whole entire process can be very challenging. I think that's common to a lot of immigrants. Yeah, but that's about it. Yeah.
I think that's one of our deaf community's most hated lines is later. Later, we'll tell you later. No, we want to know now. Why are you laughing? Tell me now. Oh, this is so funny, or that is so touching. And then I don't want to know about it an hour later or 2 hours later. I wanted to know what's happening right now. William?
That's very true. That tell you later business. I grew up, as I said, with no signing in the family. I was close to my sister, though. I had to rely on her to make phone calls to, make plans with friends to go out. She got a little aggravated by it, but how else was I going to make that happen? And it wasn't until my family moved to the US that they started to learn sign language, in this case ASL, and I helped them out too. But they sort of developed that feeling that they owed this to me. It was an unpaid debt from what I didn't get growing up in that family. And so it's nice that they came around to that eventually.
Right.
When I was growing up, the one thing that I had an interest in was math. And I say math is what saved me. I wasn't so great at the language arts, but the math teacher would spend time with me after class up at the blackboard and just repeating things, going over them as much as I needed. And I really took to it. And anything that had to do with language, I'd run the other way, but math was what saved me and got me through my education.
I remember taking math with you. I finally understood math better, right? Instead of being in a mainstream class with a bunch of hearing kids through an interpreter, I was able to have direct access and communication from a math teacher, and that was really great.
And I'm very proud of you who are my students. I have to tell you, you who moved on through graduate studies and are in wonderful professional careers and serving as role models. I can't even begin to tell you how proud all of us who taught you are.
Michelle?
I can add something, sure. With your comments, I noticed some common themes. There's biases that you've all faced as deaf people, and other biases. And I remember a Korean person who told me, called me mentally retarded for being deaf. It hasn't been easy. We have a lot of barriers, not just with communication. We have no access to education without that. When we moved to the US, I finally had access for the first time. When I went to San Francisco State University. I wish Korea had a similar system of access there for deaf individuals and advice for deaf individuals. For example, advice for my parents and their expectations for me. They expected me to be an honorable, nice, polite woman, even though I was facing a lot of discrimination for being deaf. That identity really embarrassed my parents. And when we moved here, it just became worse. I was never formally diagnosed as depressed, but I think I definitely experienced it. My father just saw me as shy and quiet, and you know, as a deaf person, we have layers and layers of discrimination that we face and barriers that we have to face. And after time with my community, and it's been an opportunity for me to grow. And so those barriers prevent us from thriving, but connection to community helps us grow.
Thank you. People who identify as deaf later on in life, they tend to be language delayed. You know, they have access, they could have access, you know, they were seen as being mentally retarded, so to speak, but if we had the access from the beginning, right? If we had what we needed, if we had language, we would be able to be capable folks that we are, right? Maybe we'd be able to accept our deaf identity sooner in life. That's something that we still need to work on, right? Today, as a community, as a society, you know, still maybe another 50 years of working on this, we'll see where we end up. William?
And just to add a little bit, I see common among all of us who have Asian backgrounds. Asian parents really focus on honoring your elders, right? Now, I'm now a math teacher, and I teach students from varying backgrounds, some who are from Asian countries, and often they aren't terribly expressive. You can't really read them very well, and we want to help people come out of their shells.
Yep.
And to accept who they are and all facets of who they are.
Right. I mean, I remember when I met Wonha and Ohlone when he first moved to the US was so quiet, you know. And after learning more about American culture, I see them embodying American culture and being more assertive, raising their hand more, being more participatory in classroom. Like I see a huge difference from who you are now compared to who you were when you first moved here. Okay, my next question for you all. Again, there's such a diversity in experiences within this group. What was the most impactful experience for you to help you become the thriving deaf Asian American that you are today? Can you share what resources that benefited you that help you become who you are today? Wonha, can you repeat that question? Resources in terms of access, maybe parents, hearing aids, interpreters. What other resources helped you kind of become who you are today and helped you thrive? Wonha. Well, for myself, I've noticed compared to 9 years ago to now, I feel like I've changed a lot. Like Renu had just mentioned about when I first came here, being quiet, not really knowing how to interact. And I think I wasn't able to express myself. I did not have enough ASL, enough language to be able to fully express myself. So a lot of people assumed I was quiet because I didn't have language or ASL at least, right? I depended a lot on technology. I would type in Korean and then have it translate to English, type in Korean, have it translate to Japanese and what other languages. And so that was one of my experience. That was my experience. And so people assumed I was quiet because I did not have the language. Walking into classrooms with the interpreter, having interpreters there. I mean, that was amazing. There was one interpreter I will never forget, Christine, and I cannot forget this person. I was so frustrated in my classes, my ASL classes, and this interpreter would write down all the terminology for me during classes and would give it to me at the end of class. I mean, what a huge help that was. And being able to look back now, I will never forget what this interpreter did for me and how much that benefited me as a student. I'm trying to remember what was the other part of your question? And Renew is saying, yeah, what other resources helped you thrive? Wonha. Right. So again, the interpreting that interpreter being able to apply for asylum here, just because I faced oppression from my family, from the faced oppression in Korea in general. And so I was able to apply for asylum and I received it, which I couldn't believe. And so that is allowing me to stay here in the US indefinitely. And so I'm really appreciative of that. That's another huge resource that I was able to get. Job opportunities, being able to get a green card. Yeah, I mean, there are still barriers, but being able to go to school, I'm able to apply for work. Being able to be a BAADA president, that has been another resources. I've learned so much along the way in the last, 8 years, 9 years of being here in the United States. And I think my motivation to understand has really driven me. And that's really kept me going. Working with Deaf Plus individuals, those relationships, seeing how I'm able to support them and help them thrive, that is another area that has helped me thrive. And honestly, BAADA, I mean, the Bay Area Asian Deaf Association, they've had such a big impact on me. There are so many deaf Asian immigrants from so many different countries that are here. The way they approach their work, their experiences, personalities are also varied and different from one another. And the way they're able to support one another. And me learning how to deal with folks, right? Some folks have a stronger personality than I do. And I think interacting with people with stronger personalities and different folks have really helped and strengthened me, my identity as myself. Right. And I think before, if I didn't have an interpreter and I asked for an interpreter and someone told me no, I would just accept it. But I think being here in the US, learning about my rights, learning about what I can and cannot ask for has really given me the courage and strength to ask for what I need. Having ASL now, being more fluent in English, that has also really helped me thrive while I've been here. Renew, thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else want to add before we move on to the next question? Barraj?
Sure. In terms of resources, I always think about, during the process of me moving here, I read a quote, a very popular quote, was about family and friends are become your stepping stones. I'm not sure if you've heard that before. That's how I see my resources, as stepping stones. If you need help to go to school or to satisfy certain duties, you can get the education that you need. You can get the resources you want. Those school and medical professionals, they all become your stepping stones. And that's just a start. We can work together to thrive together. And that's when your community becomes so important in your support.
Thank you so much. So we only have 10 minutes left before we need to wrap up. So William, excuse me.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. But about 2 years ago now, went to a meeting at Gallaudet. They had a workshop about autism type of oppression. And it was a really good one. There was a series of them. They talked about artistic oppression, employment oppression. They have a Deaf Studies journal online where you can learn more about the work they do. But one particular thing really hit me. There was an artist from Europe who was responding to mainstream education and the use of the cochlear implant. And the work that they produced on that was very powerful. It showed the son crying. And the painting showed an individual with a cochlear implant who was bleeding from the site of the operation. I really recommend that you check out the Deaf Studies Journal online from Gallaudet. And also their implementation of a bilingual, bicultural approach to education was just really incredible. They're a great resource for that. They help out with information for families. They have webinars that talk about appropriate services for children from 0 to 5. They work hard to implement Lead K, which is the goal of which is to lead to full literacy in American Sign Language and English, and full competence in written English. And we here at Ohlone are adopting some of that here. We have our own resources that we have to offer. And I think that we can be a resource for BAADA and vice versa as well. The Gallaudet resources that I mentioned, we have in our physical presence right here on our campus with the regional center.
So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next question because I think it's a pretty important question. So let's all give quick answers to our last question. What advice can we give as mentors to young Deaf Asian or Asian American? Michelle?
Sure. I just wanted to, share some advice that I found from my mentor. I was lucky to have mentors myself. I found through the social work program. I had professors that really cared about developing my skills, developing my social skills. Also connecting with BAADA was a huge resource for me. Dakara has been incredible as well. I've just connected with so many different people and I've been able to thrive because of that. Toolworks, many people there. The board members, joining the BAADA board has also helped me. So I'm so grateful to so much of what I've connected with. I've learned everything from all of you.
Yeah, Wonha. Yeah, my advice for you all is, I think when I talked about facing discrimination as a deaf person, right? Gender discrimination, facing discrimination as an Asian person. And I think we as panelists, as we shared our experiences with you all, these are things that you can keep in mind, right? And just be careful about your actions and the harm that you may or may not cause. You don't want folks to become victims, right? You don't want to traumatize or re-traumatize someone, right? Those who are deaf plus, Asian, those of a different gender expression. And unresolved harm leads to trauma. And so be considerate, be thoughtful. Before you're about to do or say something, think about it. Think about the trauma that you may cause on them, the trauma that may carry within them, and let's support one another. Learn to have patience, educate yourself, help other folks, right? If we can help others thrive and become leaders, and that is one of the greatest gifts we can give, right? That is one thing I learned from Toolworks. That is something, a gift that they've given me. Barrage, I've worked with Barrage, she is my boss, and she has given me so much. I have learned so much from her and her leadership. So be patient. I think that's one of my biggest advice, and be thoughtful and do no harm. William?
Just a quick thought. Finding a mentor isn't always that easy, but you can start by joining BAADA. You'll meet people there that have a wealth of knowledge to share with you, and you see some of them here on the screen right now. We have some great leaders within that organization. And come to Ohlone College. As you can see, Ohlone has been a good resource for a lot of folks here in thriving. And we'll be thrilled to have you here and to support you in that journey.
One has yes, I totally agree. Ohlone has been a great resource for me.
Yes, I'd like to, this is Braz speaking. Yes, I'd like to add to what William Wong mentioned. Because of this expertise and what I've learned, you have to kind of learn everything first before you can thrive. And so that's the advice is learn as much as you can, gain as much, and be inquisitive, especially from your elders. You can learn a lot from them.
So we're going to wrap up now, but thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your experiences. I mean, some of it was so heavy and personal, what you shared. I really enjoy this time with you. I really appreciate and enjoy the comments and stories you all shared. I'd like to pass it back to Tom now, and thank you again so much for sharing today. Tom?
Wow. What a powerful presentation this was. To learn about all of your personal journeys as deaf Asian Americans, deaf Asian immigrants. You're very generous with sharing some personal experiences, and you're also beautiful individuals and such important parts of our deaf community, just as parts of our American community, as well as part of the deaf Asian American community. Our focus today has been on thriving, and you all certainly have done that, and you're serving as inspirations to us all, especially the next generation. Regardless of race, gender, or any other identity that you may have, so many children still struggle with their identity or what their future could possibly look like. Your words of wisdom, the concrete experiences that you've shared will definitely be very helpful. This concludes our 4-webinar series of deaf-centered approaches to succeeding, both as a student and as a professional and as a community member. If you'd like to see the recordings of the other 3 webinars, links will be posted on the Ohlone website. They aren't there yet. That will probably happen more towards the end of June. And then we'll have the links for all 4 webinars, including this one. And we hope that people will take advantage of them. So now we'd like to close, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your summer. Bye-bye.